All right, so we're going to go through the definitions for 2540. Some of these I'm not going to go through, like these ones in yellow. Those are inside the 12 principles of animation. So anticipation, appeal, arc, exaggeration, follow through and overlapping action, in betweens, line of action, pose to pose, secondary action, slow in and slow out, solid drawing, squash and stretch, staging, straight ahead action, and twinning. Those are all inside that 12 principles of animation video on Canvas. The rest of these I'm going to go through. Some of these are kind of linked, so these ones in red are connected together, so I'll go through those at the same time just so you can see what they are. I'm going to just jump into Maya. All right, so constraints. Constraints are ways for us to connect attributes from one object to another object. So in this case, I have this, let me turn on my wireframe, there we go. I have this locator, and I've connected its position to the rotation, or I connected the rotation of the sphere to the position of this. So as I move that one around, you can see how this is basically following it. Now this is using an aim constraint, okay? Other ones that we have in here are things like, where's my constraint menu? It's under rigging, there we go. So these are all the constraints here. So that was an aim constraint. There's a scale, orient, point, and parent constraint. We'll just go through those real quick just so you can see what each one is going to do. And typically you have an item, and then you have a controller. Okay, so with this one, I'm going to grab the locator first, and then the constrained item second. And I'm going to go to constrain, and I'm going to go to parent. And what that's going to do is, instead of me actually parenting this sphere to that locator, it's connected so that they just move together. Okay. Now where that comes in handy is something like this at the foot here. In order for me to be able to pick up, oh, he's going slow now. There we go. In order for him to come here and pick this up, it's actually constrained with a. So the bar here is, at first it's constrained to the floor, and then when he picks it up, it's then constrained to his leg. And that way, as I grab his leg and move it around, that's stuck to it. If it was parented or connected the entire time, as I moved his leg here, it would move that there. So that parent constraint is pretty handy for doing that kind of stuff. I'm just going to delete that constraint. Okay, I'll do this again, and I'll go to constrain, and I'll go to point. Now, let me just scoot this off so you can see it. When I do this, you'll see that the sphere automatically jumps to it. One of the options in all of these, if I open it up, is to maintain the offset. So parent by default has that checked, but point does not. And so what that means is it's just going to jump right on top of it. And that way that locator is still moving and it's still affecting where it's positioned, but it's like locked right on top of it. If I wanted to maintain that offset, I could just say maintain offset. And then when I grab that and move it, then it just moves together. Now the other one, the orient one, or the parent one, does position and rotation, where this is just position. So if I rotate this, it does nothing for it. It's simply following where it's positioned, where it's moving around. All right, let me delete this again. So just go in here and delete the point constraint. Now I'm going to go to the next one, orient constraint. And this one, the position doesn't matter. It's all in rotation. So as one item rotates, the other item rotates. So I may want to sync up different items so that they work together. Okay. And then there's scale, which you can assume what's going to happen there. I scale this one up, and it scales the other one up. So there's easy ways for us to connect attributes together so that as I move one or adjust one, it adjusts another one, or even multiple ones. I could have this affect 100 of these things. And even inside each one of these, I could specify just one axis. So I could say just X, or just Y, or just Z. So point and orient are point, or position, and rotation. And parent is actually both. So parent will do like the translates and the rotates. Or I could specify just one or the other. They used to have just these two and not parent, and then they got parent. So now these two are really not really necessary. Okay. Let me delete that constraint again. And the way the constraints work is you always grab the item that's going to be the controller, and then shift click the item that's going to be constrained, and then you click on it. So I'm going to do an aim constraint. And now what happens is this aim constraint is moving or aiming at this locator. Now if I want to offset this, there's always attributes for these two inside of your attribute editor. So for this one, I'm going to change the aim vector. Instead of it being in the X, I'm going to set it to be in the Y. And then I'll set the up vector to X. So now you'll see that the pole of this is now aiming right at that. Okay. Some other ones that we have inside here that are not on the list, but just so you can see them. There is a point on poly. So if I go to, oops, come on, this point here, grab that, point on poly, you'll see how that locator is now stuck to that point, so that as this sphere moves, it's locked to it. And the reason you would do something like that is if you had a character that had, let's say, a shirt, and you wanted to connect a button to the shirt, you could do that kind of constraint and it would actually connect it. So it's pretty neat. We also have this geometry constraint. Oops, let's do it the other way. There we go. So now that locator is connected to the geometry. Now it's similar to the other one, except this one will kind of stay in place. As I move this, it kind of moves around it. So again, you may have a use for this at some point when you're animating something that you need that kind of interaction to happen. And then there's also normal, and that means that it's always going to stay aimed away from the surface. Okay, so you can see how it's always like basically rotating away from the surface of that. And you can use these in conjunction with each other in some cases. Sometimes you can't, and it doesn't work very good. But like geometry and normal are, this one is a point constraint, basically like the position, and this one is a rotational constraint. So if I did that, let's try it again. Nope, it doesn't want to work. It's just being silly, I think. It has them on there, it just doesn't want to update. But yeah, so you could do stuff like that. And then same thing with tangent. Oops. Oh, target must be of type NURBS. Yeah, so I typically don't use these three down here. I don't have a huge use for it. Point on poly I use, and then all of these I'll use too. Pole vector eventually we'll get into, but that's not one of our definitions right now. All right, so that's all the ones in red. That's the constraints. An animatic is a rough animation used to give you the idea of what's going to happen. So here is a 2D animatic. So they have actually sketches of the Avengers. Sometimes they'll have more 3D versions of the Avengers or whatever they're doing, and all acted out. It's all basically just to plan out where storyboards are, where cameras are, movements that the characters are going to be utilizing. Autokey is a process of how we set keys inside Maya. Let me just delete that. So typically when we set keys, we would hit S, we would scoot up a little bit, move this over, hit S again, and then we keyframe that attribute. Maya has an autokey function, which is right there. I don't use it too often because typically you accidentally move something and now I've just set a key. I move something again, I've set a key. I move something again, I've set a key. So it automatically sets keys with that autokey function. That way you don't have to keep hitting S, it's just automatically going to set keys for you. So not something I typically use, but it's good to know where it is so in case you accidentally turn it off. Baking is the method of taking something and converting its animation into actual keyframes if you don't have actual keyframes. Here's my other scene. There it is. So this sphere here, I've animated just kind of going in a circle. It's doing that based off of an expression. So I have a little bit of an expression written in here that's making it rotate in a circle. And so what I want to do is take that expression and actually make keyframes down here. So I'm going to go to Edit, Keys, and Bake Simulation. And I'm just going to say sample by, let's say, 10 frames. And then hit Bake. And what that does is it puts the keyframes now inside here. So now I can see them. Now I do get some different behavior because of the sampling of every 10 frames. It didn't have every single movement that it would have had otherwise. Okay, I'll undo that. I'll go back to Bake Simulation. I'll set this to 1 frame. And now this is taking longer, but that animation is going to be the exact animation we just saw. So you can see now I have that same exact movement. And if I go into the graph editor, I can see that same exact movement happening inside here. Okay, so that's what baking is doing, is taking something that is dynamic or expression or constrained and then locking it into actual keyframes. Blocking is where we set up a character and just kind of put them in certain spots of where we want them to be. So in some cases, like, what is that scene? Let me close that, zoom out. Like this one here, here's my character. I may have the character, let's say, start here, and then put the character, oops, let me grab the whole thing. Start here, and then put the character way over here, and then put the character way over here, and then put the character way over there. So I'm kind of blocking out like where I want the character to go. Or if they're walking down a scene, I may say, okay, at this frame you're going to be over there, at this frame you're going to be here, just so I get a sense of feel for how the motion of the scene is laying out. And I can move the character around, move the cameras around before I've done any like real hardcore animation. Blend shapes are ways that we can take a character and animate the character's pieces a little bit better. So here is not that. There we go. So here is this character with that aim constraint for the eye. And I created a blend shape that basically allows me to control the geometry deforming. So I've gone into Maya and said, okay, this is what you look like normally. And then this is what you look like when you're blinking. And Maya will blend the 2 shapes that I've set up inside here. Okay. And typically you would do that for any type of character that you do. You would have some kind of blend shape. On the Andy rig, all of these are blend shapes that are set up. So the way that this character moves is all done using different kinds of blend shapes to get these things to function correctly. They're also using expressions and some other controls, but that's the gist of it. Breakdowns are ways that we can animate stuff inside of Maya. So if I set keyframes on this, I set a beginning keyframe like so, I set an ending keyframe, and then I set 2 breakdowns in the middle of where I wanted things to go. I'm basically making a relationship between this keyframe, my 2 breakdowns, and that keyframe. So if I were to come into the graph editor and just grab these end ones and move them closer, you see how they move together. Like I don't have to grab the blend shapes and adjust those, or the breakdowns and adjust those. They just automatically keep that same proportion between all that animation. So it's a nice, easy way to be able to do that. And the way it happens is you can grab in here and then just go to keys and convert them to breakdowns, or convert them to keys if they are breakdowns. And here's what the traditional way that they would function as not a breakdown. Okay. As you're setting your keyframes, you could also right click and do breakdowns here versus making keys and then converting them. A character set is a way to set up different animation properties. So on my Andy character here, there's a lot of things that go into moving the character around and animating it. As I grab the hand and rotate it, that's, you know, some controls here. As I grab this control and I start grabbing these indicators and start moving the fingers around, there's more controls there. As I grab the elbow and grab that and rotate it, as I grab the hips or the shoulders and rotate that. So there's a lot of controls here. So down here I can create a character set that allows me to separate the upper body, lower body, and the head, so that as I'm animating, I can basically just say, okay, I'm going to focus on the legs and just animate the legs. And every time I hit S, it sets keyframes on all of those things in the lower body. And then what I can do is make a clip of those things, so that here's the lower body's animation. So I've animated the lower body doing a walk cycle, and then I can make a clip of it that I can then reuse to make Andy do a walk. Okay, so you got freaking out now because I have it set up for this demo. Control curves are just the curves that allow us to move the character around. So anytime I have a character or you see a character, all of these curves that we have on the outside, those are control curves. Just something visually that lets us grab a control and move the character around. It could be something shaped like an arrow, or it could be just a circle, or it could be a piece of geometry like these ones here, which are spheres basically. Okay, so that's what those are for. Typically, whenever you have a rig, you're going to have control curves for the rig to work correctly. Deformers are ways we can take pieces of geometry and just kind of animate them with these kind of, I don't know, faster ways to animate things. Like if I wanted to squish and squash this and stretch it out, I could definitely do that without too much of an issue, but this makes it a lot easier, okay? So I'm going to add a bunch of divisions. I'm going to go to my deform menu, go to my non-linear menu. There's a whole bunch of deformers here, but I'm going to go to non-linear and go to squash. And in here, I can go to that factor and just middle drag, and you can see how I'm able to get this to squish and squash with one slider versus having to do the scale X and Y and Z. Okay, and there's other ones in here too for, you know, bending over or flaring or sine waves. There's a whole bunch of different deformers that are inside that list. The dope sheet we've already talked about. This is where we can edit the timing of keyframes. So as we've animated something, that guy there, I can go into the dope sheet and see all the keyframes for that. Let me turn my lower body off and zoom out. There they are. So I can see the keyframes, and obviously I can adjust their timing of where those keyframes are happening at. Set driven is a way to create a link between items that is not an exact link. Okay, so as a for instance on here, let me jump back to my creature. I have this control down here. Now we did the constraints where we were able to say, you know, I want the points and the rotates and the scales and all that to be connected. But in this case, I have this controller. I want to be able to grab this pinky rotate, and I'm basically connecting this one attribute to all of these rotating. Okay, and there's a separate window that's called set driven, which eventually we'll get into. But that's what allows me to do this. I'm basically creating a connection of my own choosing. This is going from -10 to +10. And in that time, I can have this do whatever I want. If I wanted -10 to look like this, I could have -10 look like that. And if I wanted +10 to look like this, I can do that as well. Okay. You really have a lot of control when you use set driven. So a lot of our animations will use that kind of setup. Forward kinematics is a way to animate the joints of a character starting from the top down. So in this case, I'm rotating Andy's arm here. I have to start at the shoulder, and I would rotate this back and then grab this elbow and then rotate this in and then grab the wrist and then rotate that up or down. Okay. Same thing on this one. Maybe rotate this forward, maybe rotate that down, and maybe rotate this up. Okay, so we have a lot of control over doing these things, but it's this forward kinematics where we start at the top and work our way down. The other way, which we'll see on our list, I'm going to switch this to IK, is instead of grabbing the shoulder, we grab this box. And we're able to just grab the box and move it, and the box will move the entire arm. So this is called inverse kinematics. And I can rotate the wrist still and then move the whole arm around. Some cases is better for forward kinematics. Some cases are better for inverse kinematics, which is right there. And we'll see those as we move along. A flipbook is just a piece of a book of papers that allows us to make a little animation. I thought I had that already listed up there, but I did not. And we've talked about this in class already, but it's just frame by frame by frame animations. And you can do a whole lot with this, especially considering all you need is a pen, pencil, and a bunch of paper. You can really create some cool flip books. The frame rate is the amount of frames per second. In Maya, when we're animating, under our animation preferences, we have this set up to 30 frames per second here. And under our settings, 30 frames per second. We can see that if we go to display, heads-up display frame rate, it'll actually show us down here, this is how fast it's going to be playing back. So if I hit play, it's playing back at about 30 frames a second. Andy's arm is doing something weird. Okay. So obviously this is important. More frames that we have, the more detail we can pack into them, but the longer it's going to take to render out 4 frames or 5 frames or 4 seconds or 5 seconds. The graph editor is a graph that allows us to adjust our keyframing. Let me jump back to this one. I'm going to grab this leg, and I'm going to go to my graph editor, and I can see all of the stuff that I've done to that leg, and then I can adjust where these points are. So as I'm moving this here, I can adjust what that keyframe is doing. Or I can grab the handlebars and adjust how it gets from this frame to that frame to that frame by using those handlebars. Okay. Typically when we set keys, we use the dope sheet to get the timing, but this is what controls what happens between the keyframes. A hold frame is a keyframe which allows us to hold a value for a given amount of time. So for an instance, I'll go to this one. There it is. I have a light here. I'm just going to hit 6 so I can, or 7 so I can see the lighting in the scene. And then I'm going to hit play. And what we're going to see is I have no light, no light, no light. And then right around here, click, the light comes on. Okay. So I basically, there's no translation in there. There's no like easing into the light. It just goes on like a click. So I've used a hold frame to say, okay, hold that value of 0 all the way here until you get to that, and then turn on. And if I look in the graph editor, I can see that's what it is. It's taking this value of 0, doing nothing, 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 and then right when it gets to that frame, it turns itself on. Inverse kinematics we talked about. Joints and bones are what allow us to move our character around. Oops. So here is my Chickster thing, and as I move this, what's happening is I'm moving this control curve, which is moving these joints, and the joints are what control all the geometry. If I were to grab one of these and, let's say, move it, you can see how I can move that piece of skin around. Same thing here. I can grab that and move it, and it'll adjust where that skin is. Okay, so joints are typically something we would use for doing any kind of animation so that we can put pivots in a certain spot and get it to interact a little bit more realistically. Keyframes we talked about, the basic building blocks of animation. We set keyframes, more than one keyframe, we're animating stuff. A linear keyframe, and I'll also talk about spline, which is further down here. It's just the way that we're getting from one keyframe to the other. So on this foot here, if I go into my graph editor, this right now is set up as spline. It's trying to keep a nice smooth animation from one spot to the other. And it's actually on auto, which is, I think, clamped. If I set this to spline, you'll see how it comes in, it dips down, and then comes back up because it feels that this is the smoothest way to get from this keyframe to this keyframe to that keyframe. And so spline will do something just like that. The other one is linear, which is like this, which means it just goes to it. There's no smoothness. It's just like, okay, go here, then go here, then go there, then go there, then go there. It's not considering any of the other keys. Typically, you'll find you'll need a mix of keyframes and even a little bit of manual tweaking on these to get them to look the way you want them to look, to blend the way you want them to blend. And sometimes, even though it might seem overwhelming because there's so many different areas, you might be jumping into all of these different menus and adjusting all of these to get the animation to look nice and smooth. Motion capture is a way to digitally record human movement. You see this a lot in movies now where they have these characters walk around with suits on, and the suits have these little reflective spheres They're basically like ping pong balls. And those are caught by the cameras, which then record the movements and send it over to some sort of skeleton or CG character. A lot of the 3D characters for video games and movies are using motion capture for that purpose. Physics is the way we realistically move around the world. The way objects move. So whenever we do like a character jumping or bouncing or whatever, we try to take into consideration some sort of physics. When I hit play on this character, watch the tail feathers here. You can see how they're kind of like swaying a little bit. They have a little bit of physics added to them. So basically, it's going through and saying, okay, well, if these are feathers, they're going to have some weight to it, so they would be kind of bouncy. And that's what they're doing. The character looks around, and you can see those kind of softly kind of bouncing up and down a little bit. Even if we don't have actual physics in there, we always try to emulate that. So when we do a bouncing ball, it's not like the ball is going to hit the ground and then softly come up and then hit the ground and softly come up. The ball is going to bounce. It's going to like boing, 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 and move along. Okay, so we're always trying to emulate physics in CG by studying real world objects. A Playblast is a playback of our animation. Whenever we hit play here, we're really kind of letting the computer play back as fast as it can, and that may not always be very quick. In this case, it's going, pretty quick. Let's go to my Andy animation here. Andy, where are you? There it is. I'm going to set this arm back to FK, so the arm goes back to where it was. And I'm going to go to the smoothest mode I can go on Andy. And then I'm going to hit play, and you're going to see how slow this is actually playing back. 267, 278, 279. So it's playing back in about a frame a second. So sometimes we need to see what it's going to look like in real time. So if you right-click in your timeline, you can go to Playblast option box. I don't need to show the ornaments. I'm going to save this as an image. I'm going to save it as Maya, and I'm going to save it as 100%. And then just hit Playblast. And what this does, it goes through and renders it out to basically just a picture viewer of what I'm seeing. So it won't be like lights and cameras and all that. It'll just be what we saw in the viewport. Then I can say, okay, this is a 30 frame per second animation. And this is going to be in real time what it's going to look like. It's getting to the end. Now we're starting over again. So it's always good to do these play blasts throughout so you can get a nice feel for how the animation is actually playing back. Poses in animation represent how the character is going to be positioned. It's for not just a character like this, but for any real character that you're doing. This is a character posing while he's lifting this block up. So he has this pose here where he's looking at it, this pose where he's bent over, this pose where he's holding it back, lifting it up, and then dropping it on. Okay, so all of these are poses that will then lead to an animation of our character. Skidding is a way to use joints to manipulate solid geometry. So in this case here, the eye is a solid piece of geometry. I don't want it to deform like squish and squash, okay? So the eye actually doesn't do any of that. But the rest of the Chickster does. So the way that I'm able to tell Maya, hey, here are some bones, and then here is a piece of geometry, it could actually go through and say, okay, if you have bones and you have geometry, we can do what's called skinning, where we connect those two things together. So that as the bones move, that moves the skin, and we get this kind of motion that we're getting now where the skin is moving around. Spline keyframes I went over. Stop motion. You've probably seen this all over the place. This is stop motion using clay. So basically they take a picture, move some stuff, take a picture, move some stuff, take a picture, move some stuff. And they keep doing that over and over and over again until they get the animation that they could then play. If you ever go to YouTube, you can look up, stop motion time lapse, and you'll see these amazing videos of people doing that kind of thing. Timeline is just where we can see where our frames are at. So down here, that's our timeline. We can see whatever we have selected keyframes, and if I deselect, the keyframes go away. I pick something else. There we go. And there's those keyframes. Timing is a space between the keyframes or between the actions, which relates to the speed of the animation. So however close your keyframes are, however far, that's how fast or slow something's going to move. So you have to make sure that your timing for your keyframes is good, and that will just help your animation look good. And then finally, zoetrope. And a zoetrope is this thing. Basically, before they had TVs and stuff like that, they would take these pictures on the inside of a drum, and if you spin the drum, you look through one of these slats, you can actually see the animation playing. So each one of these is basically a frame by frame of an animation. So very much like a stop motion or very much like a flipbook, except it has obviously a very limited amount of frames. However many would go around there is what you get. All right. So there's our definitions. Make sure you watch the 12 Principles Animation 2 to get the other ones. And there we